September 1943. Inside a quiet barracks somewhere in the American Midwest, an Italian prisoner of war sat at a wooden table beneath a dim electric light. The man's name was Antonio Rinaldi. In front of him lay a sheet of paper. He stared at it for several minutes before finally beginning to write. The first sentence troubled him, not because he did not know what to say, but because he feared his own mother would never believe it. He dipped the pen into ink and slowly wrote, "Mama, you must not worry. They treat us better than soldiers in our own army." Antonio paused. Even to him, the words sounded impossible. Just months earlier, he had been fighting in the deserts of North Africa. Now he was sitting in a prison camp thousands of miles away, eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a warm bed. Outside the window, electric lights illuminated the entire compound. American guards walked calmly along the fence line. No shouting. No beatings. Just quiet routine. Antonio folded the letter carefully. Somewhere across the ocean, his family was struggling to survive a war-torn country. And here he was, an enemy soldier, living in conditions he had never imagined possible. Years later, historians would ask a simple question. Why did thousands of Italian prisoners say American prison camps felt almost like paradise? The answer begins long before they ever set foot in America. Most of the Italian soldiers who ended up in American prison camps were captured in North Africa. By early 1943, the war in that region had turned disastrous for Italy. Supply lines were collapsing. Food and ammunition arrived less and less frequently. Many Italian units found themselves fighting under terrible conditions. In some areas, soldiers survived on little more than bread and canned rations for weeks at a time. Antonio remembered the final days clearly. His division had been stationed near the Tunisian coast. German forces were retreating. British and American troops were closing in from multiple directions. The Italian officers knew the situation was hopeless. One morning, white flags appeared across the battlefield. For thousands of exhausted soldiers, the war ended not with victory or defeat, but with surrender. None of them knew what would happen next. For years, fascist propaganda had warned Italian soldiers about enemy prison camps. They had been told terrible stories. Prisoners would be starved. They would be beaten. They would be forced to work until exhaustion. Some soldiers believed they might never leave captivity alive. When Antonio and the others were loaded onto transport ships in North Africa, fear spread through the crowded decks. Nobody knew where they were going. Rumors circulated constantly. Some believed they were heading to Britain. Others feared they might be sent to remote islands. No one imagined they were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. But that is exactly what was happening. The voyage to America lasted nearly 2 weeks. For many prisoners, the journey itself was the first surprise. The ships were large cargo vessels carrying supplies across the Atlantic. But instead of empty returning voyages, they transporting prisoners of war. Despite the cramped conditions, the Italian soldiers noticed something strange. The American sailors treated them calmly. Meals were distributed regularly. Medical staff treated wounded prisoners. Antonio remembered watching the ship's crew at work. The vessel contained equipment he had rarely seen before. Large radar devices. Powerful communication radios. Machinery that operated smoothly day and night. The scale of American industry began revealing itself long before they ever reached land. But the real shock came when the ships finally reached the United States. When the prisoners disembarked at an American port, many of them stood silently, staring at the surroundings. The harbor stretched for miles. Cranes moved enormous cargo containers. Dozens of ships loaded and unloaded supplies simultaneously. Antonio had never seen anything like it. But what stunned the prisoners even more was the civilian life around them. Workers drove automobiles. Shops displayed food and goods in their windows. Electric signs glowed at night. In wartime Italy, many families struggled to obtain basic necessities. Here, the streets appeared full of abundance. For the first time, some prisoners quietly wondered if the propaganda they had heard might not be entirely true. From the ports, the prisoners were transporting by train across the country. Eventually, Antonio's group arrived at a prison camp surrounded by fences and guard towers. The men stepped off the train cautiously. They expected shouting, perhaps violence. Instead, an officer addressed them through a translator. "You will receive medical examinations, food, and new clothing." The Italian soldiers looked at one another. They had not expected such instructions. Soon they were escorted into processing buildings where doctors examined injuries and illnesses. Some prisoners received treatments they had been waiting months for. Others were given clean uniforms to replace worn-out clothing from the battlefield. But the biggest surprise came that evening. The prisoners entered a large mess hall. Metal trays were placed in their hands. Food waited along a serving counter. Bread, stewed meat, vegetables, milk. Many prisoners hesitated. Some believed the meal might be a trick. But the American cooks simply motioned for them to move forward. Antonio sat down at a long wooden table and stared at his tray. The portion was larger than any meal he had eaten during the final months of the war. Around him, dozens of men began eating quietly. After several minutes, the room filled with murmurs of disbelief. The meal had been real. And the next morning, it happened again. As weeks passed, the Italian prisoners slowly adjusted to camp life. They were still confined behind barbed wire. Guards still watched the towers. But daily life was far different from what they had imagined. Barracks contained electric lighting. Showers provided hot water. The camp hospital possessed modern equipment. Many prisoners began comparing these facilities to what they had experienced in their own army. Some joked that the camp kitchens served better meals than military field rations. Of course, the prisoners still longed to return home. But the fear they had felt upon arrival slowly faded. Eventually, many prisoners were assigned work duties. International law allowed prisoners of war to work as long as the tasks were not directly related to combat. Italian prisoners helped harvest crops, repair roads, and assist with construction projects. For men who had spent years in war zones, the routine offered a strange kind of peace. They woke each morning, completed their tasks, returned to camp in the evening. Sometimes they even interacted with local civilians. Antonio remembered the first time he saw a large American farm. The land seemed endless. Tractors moved slowly across vast fields. Machines performed work that would require dozens of laborers in Italy. He could hardly believe the scale of production. Over time, relationships began forming between prisoners and guards. Conversations started cautiously. Some guards had Italian ancestry. Others were simply curious about life in Europe. Antonio practiced English whenever he could. One evening, he sat outside the barracks when a guard approached carrying a small radio. Music drifted through the air. To Antonio's surprise, it was an Italian song. The guard smiled. "My grandmother came from Sicily." Moments like these changed how many prisoners viewed their situation. They were still enemies in a global war. But inside the camp, they were also simply men living side by side. Despite the relative comfort of camp life, the prisoners constantly worried about their families. Italy was experiencing devastating bombings and political upheaval. News occasionally reached the camps through newspapers or radio broadcasts. When Italy eventually surrendered to the Allies in 1943, everything changed. Italian prisoners were no longer viewed purely as enemy soldiers. Many volunteered to assist Allied efforts through labor units. Thousands joined work programs that supported agriculture and logistics. Their status slowly shifted from prisoners to cooperative workers. For Antonio and many others, the greatest impact of captivity was not the food or the shelter. It was what they observed about American society. Workers owned cars. Cities were filled with factories and stores. Farmers used machines that produced enormous harvests. For soldiers raised under authoritarian rule, the idea that a democratic country could achieve such prosperity was surprising. Some prisoners began asking difficult questions. Had their government been wrong? Was there another way for a nation to succeed? One of the most emotional moments came during the winter holidays. Local communities sometimes sent packages to the camps. Inside were small gifts: chocolate, cigarettes, toiletries. Church services were held inside camp chapels. Italian carols echoed through the buildings. American guards quietly attended the ceremonies. For many prisoners, it was the first peaceful Christmas they had experienced since the war began. Years later, when former prisoners described their experiences, journalists often misunderstood their words. When they said the camps felt like paradise, they did not mean that captivity itself was pleasant. They meant something different. Compared to the hunger, fear, and propaganda of wartime Europe, the camps represented stability, safety, human dignity. For many Italian soldiers, the experience changed their understanding of the world. Some eventually returned to America after the war. Others carried new ideas back to Italy as their country rebuilt itself. Antonio Rinaldi never forgot the day he stepped off that train in America. He had expected cruelty. He had prepared for suffering. Instead, he discovered something entirely unexpected. Not freedom, but a glimpse of a different society. A place where even enemy soldiers were treated with basic humanity. And that is why thousands of Italian prisoners later described their time in American camps with a surprising phrase. Not because prison was wonderful, but because after years of war, starvation, and propaganda, it showed them a world they never believed existed. A world that felt, at least by comparison, almost like paradise.